initially I just pushed back very politely as, scientists trying to ask them, what do you mean there's 5 sexes? What do you mean sex is a spectrum or it's a social construct? And instead of getting back the scientific arguments, the debates, the evidence, it was just immediately, you're a horrible person, you're a transphobe.
Did it really piss you off?
Well, it stems from a misunderstanding of what they have about what the fundamental property of being male or female actually is. And if you don't understand this single nugget of truth, then you have no anchor. You're just sort of floating freely without any tether to reality.
Why do men have nipples?
Yeah, so it has to do with...
Give me a brief rundown of your scientific background.
So I'm an evolutionary biologist. I did my undergrad at UC Davis for my Bachelor's of Science in Evolution, Ecology, and Biodiversity. I went to UC Santa Barbara and I got my degree in evolution, ecology, and marine biology, although I didn't study marine biology. That's just sort of tacked on the degree. I studied animal personalities, like collective personalities of social insects and arachnid societies, which was pretty cool. And then I started, so I did a postdoc at Penn State for a couple of years. And that's when I started seeing a lot of, I guess, the what we would call like the sex and gender debates start popping up on friends' social media, on the social media accounts of professors and students I was in, making weird claims about the biology of sex, saying things like, didn't you know that there's 5 sexes, or that sex is a spectrum, or that it's like a social construct? And I did some initial pushback on there because part of what I did as an animal behavior scientist is we need to know what biological sex is, the fundamental aspect of sex that's rooted in gametes. It's a type of reproductive strategy. And we need to know how to identify males, not just in humans, but in wasps that I studied, in ants that I studied, and spiders that I studied, because the sex of an individual predicts lots of different downstream effects on it, like its body, its behavior, that type of thing. And so knowing the universal fundamental defining property of sex, it was clear that people had a really unclear idea of what sex was. And so initially I just pushed back very politely as, scientists trying to ask them, what do you mean there's 5 sexes? What do you mean sex is a spectrum or it's a social construct? And instead of getting back the scientific arguments, the debates, the evidence, it was just immediately, you're a horrible person, you're a transphobe, all this type of stuff. And so I just sort of leaned into it since then, because part of the reason I became a scientist in the first place is so I could talk about true facts of biology. At least I thought that's what we were all there for. And then I was getting more and more pushback, and I just decided to keep leaning into it and write some popular articles for Quillette early on that went super viral. And then I just kind of became a go-to person to talk about the biology of sex because nobody else was talking about it. And so 5-6 years later, I'm still talking about it. And yeah, and here we are.
I think for most people, even listening to people who are not experts in their field, like everybody listening to this now, watching this now, they do their job, whatever it is, and they're an expert in it because that's why they do their job. And there's nothing more frustrating than hearing from people who don't do their job and aren't experts in their field, whatever it might be, that they know better than you and they're just coming. Did it really piss you off?
Yeah, I mean, you can see what the activists are saying on it, and there's a pure sort of ideological underpinning to what they're saying. When I initially got into it, it was just some people are wrong about the biology of sex, and I'm going to just correct them in a very academic way. And then when I looked under the hood a bit more, it's clear that, well, what's buttressing their arguments, if you can call them that, isn't evidence and reason. It's all this ideological baggage that's underneath it. That's they view it as sort of the civil rights cause rather than just a statement of fact about what the biology of sex are, what makes an individual, an organism, male or female. And so hearing a lot of people, you get anthropologists that talk about it, like these cultural anthropologists, who just are the worst on this topic completely. You get medical doctors who talk about the biology of sex, but they have sort of a pragmatic way that they approach the biology of sex, where they try to put it in these different layers, these different levels, where they'll talk about chromosomal sex or your hormonal sex or the gametes that you produce. And there's like a pragmatic reason they do this, because they're doctors, they need to diagnose illnesses and problems. And so they sort of look at sex and sex-related traits on a hierarchy of causation. Because if you're a biological male, you have testes, you produce sperm, but for some reason your testosterone is really low. That could be because you have testicular cancer or something like that. So doctors will sort of look at sex in this sort of layered system, even though sex itself is not layered. It's there's the causes of sex, there's what sex is, and then there's sort of downstream consequences of sex, which, there's a lot of variation between males and females, not just in humans, but in every animal and plant that there is. So it's disheartening seeing sort of an activist takeover of a lot of the sciences, and the people who should be pushing back, the ones who are experts in this area, are just kind of been cowed into silence because they don't want to push back. They see what happens when people speak up about this stuff, and they'd much rather just continue on getting their grants and doing their lab work.
I suppose, we're going to talk in the second half of this about evolution as well. So the problem of magical thinking, I suppose, on the right, when people, we'll talk about Tucker Carlson and what he said. But I suppose, is it no surprise that this would also happen on the left, just a different version of it? Because humans are humans, whatever side you are on politically, and we're always going to do some magical thinking.
I think that's right. So I started... So back when before I became an evolutionary biologist, when I was still a student, I ran a blog. It was called Warm Little Pond. It was from Darwin's talking about the origin of life. He's sort of hypothesized that it could have started in a warm little pond somewhere. And I was mainly interested in debunking a lot of the creationist and intelligent design arguments about evolution, mainly because I just think it's harmful, but at an individual and a societal level, if we're denying fundamental truths about biology, things that are absolutely true. We can't know a lot about medicine, about our behavior, if we're not taking evolution into account. So I dedicated so much time to just debunking these arguments. It's actually why I became an evolutionary biologist in the first place. I found myself just reading papers and textbooks about evolutionary biology, and then I just got obsessed with the topic, and then I just became an evolutionary biologist. And while I was doing that, my colleagues were very happy to see me pushing back against the creationists, the intelligent design people. And I would also try to debunk things like alternative medicines, the ones that aren't based in science and stuff like that. All sort of like quackery, I guess, if you want to call it. Yes, exactly. And then when I saw this whole sex spectrum, sex as a social construct stuff, to me, I was just criticizing another new type of sex pseudoscience or biology pseudoscience that was out there. But instead of getting the support of my colleagues, since this was an idea that's mainly coming out of left-wing circles, it was just this sacrosanct belief. They wouldn't allow it to be criticized. Where I'm just trying to not play tribes. I'm just trying to criticize pseudoscience wherever I see it, and using my same approach, just trying to be very calm and measured and explain to people why I think they're wrong, and being willing to receive pushback and have a back and forth on these topics as well.
I think what's really sad is that if we know that if we all stood up and just said what most people think about biological reality, there wouldn't be a problem anymore. I've been cancelled now. I've been disinvited. I've not been able to speak about it properly yet, but from several book festivals and bookshops, and for doing, just to sell my book. It's got nothing to do with The Culture Wars, my book, The Psychology of Secrets, but because of things I've said about gender and trans. So that's still happening in 2024, even though it does seem to have calmed down a little bit. The whole, I think more and more rational people are coming out of the woodwork. But we know from history the banality of evil. We know like a lot of it comes from people just not speaking up. And I just want to encourage anyone listening and watching, like, I don't want anyone to get fired because of what I say. But at the same time, if we all do it at once, if the festivals don't fire me really because they care about gender, they care about getting bad press. Well, if they got worse press from cancelling people, and if they continue to get bad press from cancelling people for expressing views about biological reality, then they wouldn't be incentivized to cancel us anymore. What is a steel manning of a man can be a woman? I mean, I suppose there are. If you think about it, you take estrogen and you sort of. I know you can't make your willy into a vagina, but what's the steel man here?
So the steel man is that Well, it stems from a misunderstanding of what they have about what the fundamental property of being male or female actually is. And if you don't understand this single nugget of truth, then you have no anchor. You're just sort of floating freely without any tether to reality. So what a male and female are fundamentally, they're different reproductive strategies. They're evolved reproductive strategies. Males are the evolved strategy of producing many small gametes called sperm, and females are denoted as the sex. And this is universal across all plants and animals, not just humans. They're the individuals that produce fewer larger gametes or ova or eggs. A hermaphrodite isn't a third sex. They're just individuals who are both male and female. And
That's weird.
Yeah, they're utilizing both of those reproductive strategies. This isn't something that's found in humans, but garden snails, certain frogs, that type of things. That they are either simultaneous hermaphrodites, they're producing both the gametes at the same time, or they're sequential, so they're doing sperm at one time and ova at another time. Sometimes it's like a life cycle thing.
Oh. Why is that? Why does that happen? And also, just anyone watching, I do apologize for saying that's weird. I don't mean to offend any hermaphrodites watching. Statistically, there probably are some, so I don't mean weird in a horrible way. Just fascinating scientifically. But why does that happen?
Well, there's like the mechanisms that can spur this on to happen. So in clownfish, they have just an interesting evolved hierarchy where they're trying to get access to the anemone. The individual that's in the anemone, it's a very valuable limited resource. And they're the females that are in this anemone. If the female dies, the next male will come up and there'll be a change in their hormonal profile. And it'll actually facilitate a change in their gonadal tissue, and they'll change from male irreversibly to female. It just benefits them more as a female having access to those resources than it does being a male in that situation. And there's this whole dominance hierarchy of males beneath that system. You see it a lot in fish. It's one reason is because it's easier as a fish to change the type of gamete you're producing. Fish don't need an intromission organ like a penis or anything like that, or a vagina. They just need to change some of their tissue, and then they just sort of emit their gametes into the ocean. It doesn't require a lot of secondary sex characteristics in order to achieve fertilization. So it's much more simple. But once you get like the change going onto land, you have females, at least if you're a mammal, you're carrying offspring inside of you. So your bodies are sort of cemented into the role of either male or female, because you can't just change all of that anatomy. It's there, and it can't just go away just by turning on some hormones. So the main issue, the main problem that a lot of the activists are doing here is they're ignoring gametes as the fundamental defining characteristic, and they're looking at what are called secondary sex characteristics. So the characteristics that human males and females exhibit and that come about because of puberty. So males get taller, we get facial hair, our voices get deeper, we get hairier. Women, they grow breasts, fat distribution over the bodies, all the things that sort of socially, when we're looking at somebody, we're not looking at people's gametes, we're looking at your secondary sex characteristics, the way your face looks, and we're using that as a proxy for what someone's sex is. And everyone knows that some women have very masculine features and some males have very feminine features, and it could be sometimes you'll get it wrong. Very rarely you'll get it wrong, but sometimes you do. And so what activists, they're seizing on this fact that there is a lot of variation and overlap in secondary sex characteristics. And they're saying, well, means that there's variation of sex itself, when that's not the case. We all know that males in general are taller than females, but we wouldn't say that a small female, or a short male is somehow like has a height sex of being female or something. It's just, no, they're still male. They're just a short male. A female with masculine hands is just a female with masculine hands. A female with a deep voice is just a female with a deep voice, whatever. But they would like to say that all of these traits are sort of combined statistically to make someone male or female. And because all of these traits exist on, somewhat of a spectrum, well, this can all be changed. If you take hormones, this changes your secondary sex characteristics. If you have surgeries, this changes your secondary sex characteristics. And we can make someone statistically more male or female. Whereas, if your view of sex is purely based on secondary traits, sure, you can change your sex, but that's not what sex is. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what sex is. So that's the best way I can steelman them, is that they're just a misunderstanding at a fundamental level of what sex is, because it doesn't apply to other species if you think about it. So they might say, well, we have testosterone is the male sex hormone, and that high testosterone levels are associated with being male. Well, that's only in humans, though. Like other species that have males and females don't have testosterone linked to the biological sex. And the only way that they can say that XY chromosomes are associated with males and humans, or testosterone is associated with males, or beards are associated with males, is because there is something else apart from beards and testosterone and chromosomes that all those things correlate with. And that thing is the type of gamete an individual has the function to produce. So all those arguments, they actually rely on the gametic definition of sex, even if they don't quite realize it.
What has happened to a human who is a hermaphrodite?
So there's, in the medical literature, you'll hear the word hermaphrodite being used to describe humans. They'll say like a true hermaphrodite. And as a biologist, I want to push back against that, because when I think of a true hermaphrodite, I'm thinking of like a garden snail that is literally both male and female. They're producing sperm or ova. There are no examples in the medical literature of an individual human that is a true hermaphrodite in the sense that they're like a snail. Sometimes they might have bits of ovarian tissue and testicular tissue, like ovotestes, for instance. There are some rare cases where a person could have one ovary and one testicle, but they're only ever fertile for one of those things. And also, even if we were to find a perfect example of a human that's producing both eggs and sperm, that would be medically very interesting, but it also wouldn't be an example of someone who's a third sex. It wouldn't be a negation of the binary nature of sex, because that would just be an individual that is both male and female into one, not like a third sex category, because that would require a third gamete that they're able to produce, which there is not.
Interesting. There's a great book called Middlesex. Have you ever read that?
I haven't, but I've been told I need to read that.
It's really good, and I don't think it gets political at all. Really, it doesn't take a side in anything. It's just a person who is into sex and grows up that way, and it's a fascinating read. Something really difficult to do, I think. Weird to imagine snail sperm. I just started thinking about, like, what does that look like? Is it all gunky? Well, it will be, won't it? Gunky anyway.
Yeah, I've actually never looked at it, but I would imagine it probably looks very similar to just human sperm.
White.
I don't know about the actual secretion itself, because in humans, the white is mainly the prostate fluid that's sort of used to carry the sperm. But the sperm itself, you wouldn't be able to see. It doesn't really have its own color.
And snails probably don't have prostates, do they?
No, they don't.
Just thinking about that.
That's a mammal thing.
Is there any evidence at all for like, and I put like before because I know how specious this is, but a male brain, a woman brain, female brains, that stuff?
This is like a big topic, because you see a lot of the activists try to, they play both sides of it. On one hand, there's no male or female brain. That's sexist to think that males and females have different brains. On the other hand, you have them trying to stand up for, trans rights by saying that, a trans woman has a female brain, they're born that way. And so these are actually two contradictory views. It's either born that way or it's socialized into it. So how I try to approach this is looking at the human brain like you would look at any other organ that males and females have. So when we look at brain scans, many thousands of them for males and females, to the normal observer, it's just meat. You can't really tell differences, but there are actually sex-related differences. They're not absolute differences. It's not like you're going to find, people always say like, well, what is a male brain or a female brain? It's not going to be like one trait that's going to set it apart. It's not like one's made of wood, the other's made of metal. There's something like fundamentally different about these two brains. There are usually statistical differences. And I usually like to talk about human faces to sort of convey this. So you can look at the face of a male or a female, and you can look at thousands of male faces and thousands of female faces and sort of get like the average male and female face. But if someone were to ask you like what makes the face male or female, it's not any one thing. It's when we go through puberty, Testosterone sort of changes our facial features all in a very systematic, directional way, where our eyes get more, set back, or we have a thicker brow ridge, or jaws get more this way. The shape of the nose, the texture of the skin, all of these things sort of contribute to what we would call like a masculinizing of someone's face. If you were to look at faces, you can predict with high certainty what the sex of an individual is. But it's not going to be, you're not going to get it right all the time. So there's variation. There's definitely this clustering of characteristics that we would say is a typical male face and a typical female face. But this sort of statistical argument for sex differences applies also to brains. Brains can vary in slightly different ways. They can be masculinized or feminized. It doesn't mean that there's blue and pink brains, but there are average male typical brains and female typical brains, just like there's male typical height. Just like you can look at someone's hands, you can look at digit ratios and how much hair is on the hand, and you can look at masculinization and feminized hands. So are there male and female brains? Not if we're trying to talk about binary, this is a male brain, this is blue and pink boxes with no variation in between. But are brains masculinized and feminized in a sex-specific way? Yes. But there can also be males that have, put them in a brain scan and they have a brain that looks more feminine than most females. And you can have some females who have brains that appear more masculine than most males. Are they born in the wrong body? Do they have, no. If does a woman with very masculine hands, is she born with the wrong hands? This is just natural variation.
Yeah. I always say I've got really small hands.
Yeah.
Look at these. Would you guess
small.
They were women's hands?
It would be probably leaning more towards the feminine side of things. Yeah.
It's hard to imagine because I've got my big bearded face in the middle.
Yeah.
But they're small hands. So this is a really interesting thing though, because you think of, the contradiction that you mentioned earlier, and I think Judith Butler's fallen into this as much as anybody who, for anyone who doesn't know, that's someone who writes terribly about stuff. She's won awards for her terrible writing, an academic called Judith Butler. She was the one in the 80s or whenever it was, pushing this idea of like everything's just a social construct. So basically we've got the same brains and everything's just a social construct. And the contradiction being now it's like, oh no, but you've got a female brain and a male brain. They would say to you, I suppose, if you're Steelman again, their argument, oh, you're saying you're on the other side of, we're basically, sorry, just to get that right again, we're saying that she's actually wrong about both, I think, that it's just a social, because the idea that we've got the same brains isn't true. We've got slightly different brains on average. And also the idea that you have to be one or the other is also wrong. And I suppose what you're putting forward is more nuanced. You're saying, no, and that's what they're missing. Is that right? They're missing the nuance in the brains are different. There are sort of male and female brains, but not, firstly, they're secondary characteristics. And secondly, oh my gosh, I've lost myself in the mad. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's, yes. Judith Butler, it's hard to know exactly what she got wrong because you're tempted to say just about everything, and it's fractally wrong, where it's wrong at every conceivable scale of resolution. So yeah, because she goes back and forth between using sex and gender interchangeably when it suits her, in order to get sort of her ideas out there. But yeah, I would just say from a biological perspective, a male brain is any brain that is in a male body. And a female brain is any brain, no matter how masculinized or feminized, it's in a female body. A lot of the activists are trying to portray the varying degrees of masculinization or feminization of brains as a brain sex. And then because they like to fillet out sex in multiple levels, they will say that, well, your body might be male. You might have, normal looking penis and testes. You could have, you have a beard and a deep voice. But your brain is very feminized. So you have a female brain sex. And that disparity between the body and the brain is what they would say is this, that mind, body, or the gender identity body disconnect. And then the idea behind the gender affirming care is that we can actually use, if you feel dysphoria, if you're feminine in your expression and your behavior, but you have a very masculine body, they see that as a mismatch between your brain sex or gender identity and your physical sex. But the gender affirming care model is that, well, all of your physical features, those can be changed, and we can bring you your physical sex into alignment with your brain sex in order to achieve gender euphoria, or at least you'll no longer be, your body will no longer be out of whack with your brain. You can't try to change someone's mind or anything like that, because that's categorized as conversion therapy.
Yeah.
But somehow, making gay people straight or whatever by modifying your body, that's not. That's completely, it's gender affirming care.
So this is the thing, though, because I suppose if freedom loving or liberty loving individuals, you might say, hey, you go do that. You can go and live. You feel like you're a woman. I mean, the issue I've got is the idea that you then, the policies, isn't it? I mean, you go and live in a woman, but it doesn't mean you can now, that everybody else has to see you as a woman. Otherwise, for all intents and purposes, that individual can say, I feel like I'm a woman, whatever you think a woman is in your head, and I'm running around acting like I'm a woman. Okay, it might be offensive to some women, but you're an individual, you're free to do what you want, but it doesn't mean you can go into female prisons, female sports
exactly.
teams.
I mean, people are free to view themselves however they wish. I don't even know how you could prevent someone from viewing someone how they want to view themselves. But yeah, it's whether we should all go along with their self-perception. And I'm coming from this classical liberal side, and I thought we were achieving a lot of success in this idea that we were correctly identifying that there was a lot of variation in the degree to which people conform to sex stereotypes. There's masculine and feminine girls, masculine and feminine boys. And we were at least going in the direction as a society of saying, that's completely normal. If you don't like that, deal with it. Like, these people exist and we should accept them. And now we've kind of just gone the complete opposite. We're saying, well, the boy who's very feminine, you're no longer a boy, you're actually a girl, you're stuck in the wrong body and we need to change you. I'm just for the hands-off principle. Like, these are just normal people. This is just natural variation, and we need to let them be who they are. But then they would interpret "be who you are" as like, well, they're born in the wrong body, so being who they are is modifying.
It's sort of, I feel like it's authoritarianism coming from a benevolent dictator rather than a not nice.
It was on the right path, and then it just totally got derailed. And that's when I jumped off the train before it went off over the cliff.
Humans in big groups, they're just always going to do that. They're always going to start telling people they're in the wrong body, they're in the wrong thing, there's something wrong with who they are.
Well, both the right and the left have a really big problem with gender non-conforming individuals. You had the people on the far Christian right who don't like their feminine sons potentially being homosexual, and so they tried to change their brains to match your body, try to change your behaviors. And then on the far left, we have just the opposite, where they're, they claim to be accepting of it, but now they're saying, well, we need to change your body to match your brain. It's just two ways to achieve the same end result, basically.
Is it mostly sort of young girls who want to become boys and then older men who want to be women?
Yeah, that's the current pathway. So it used to be more boys would want to become girls, and later in life, and a higher proportion of them would choose to transition later in life, and that has flipped. Now it's mostly girls. But there's two pathways for males. One is sort of the homosexual pathway, like very effeminate young boys who grow up and they feel this. It's not merely just gender nonconformity, but it's kind of very centered at hating their genitals and wanting to change them, and really this internal feeling of being born in the wrong body that has nothing to do with just their conformity to stereotypes. And then you have the other pathway that's the sort of autogynephilic route, which is straight males who later in life, it's autogynephile just means sort of being turned on, envisioning yourself as a woman. And this sometimes, I think, it probably tricks people into misinterpreting these feelings of arousal with feelings of that being the natural fit for your body and what you are. And I'm fine with either of these people, as adults choosing to transition if that's something they want to do. It's mainly just the kids side of thing, where we need to make sure that they're appropriate age before they're making these like life altering, often sterilizing decisions.
The funny thing about AGP or autogynephilia is it's an extremely male thing, I would imagine, the sort of sexuality of getting into that fetishistic mind.
Yeah.
I saw recently, there was an interview, you won't know because it's a UK guy called Grayson Perry, who's long been sort of heralded as I suppose a cross-dresser or a transvestite more than, I'm not sure that they've had anything done or he's had anything done downstairs. But he goes on all sorts of shows, doesn't try and really, it's more drag than anything else. It's a low voice he's got. But he was asked recently on a radio show, do you think that the problem people have is that you're doing something that you're getting some sort of sexual gratification out of, and that people around you who are witnessing you and around you haven't consented to being part of that? And he actually said yes, and just was honest about it. But he's turned up, there's a picture of him, he turned up at a children's hospital charity thing wearing a giant dildo. And because he's an artist, he sort of got away with it. And I feel like that's tantamount to the Jimmy Savile stuff. You know about Jimmy Savile in the UK? That was I call them PDF files on the show. You can't call them by the real name because YouTube gets cancelled. People who go after children at the BBC, and they hid it for decades, basically. And he was getting up to all sorts. And that's, for me, this is the kind of thing that in 20 years, they'll look back and it's like, this guy turns up with a dildo like at a children's charity and everyone's like, oh, how brave and wonderful.
Yeah. No, there used to be that distinction, I guess, with cross-dressing. I've even seen some trans organizations like try to claim cross-dressers as part of the trans umbrella. Whenever the stereotypical cross-dresser, at least when I was growing up, was like Eddie Izzard. Yeah,
but Eddie Izzard has now
decided that he identifies as a woman now, and is using women's spaces. Yeah. I feel like Izzard was applauded early on as sort of like this gender bending, and it was sort of a fun, playful type thing until it got really serious and started going into women's places, and that's when a lot of people said, okay, you've gone a little too far, because he was very adamant early on about, I'm a transvestite. I'm not a woman. I think he called himself an executive transvestite because he dressed very stunning for when he cross-dressed.
It's just the power of social contagion, I think, isn't it? He seemed to be perfectly happy doing what he was doing. We don't know, obviously, what he was really thinking, but now the society's created something that maybe he would have felt like he was being a coward to not come out fully and say, yes, I am this thing, embrace me, I get virtue points for it.
Yeah, I think it's also a stepping stone for a lot of the autogynephile type people. Like, they might start out cross-dressing and there's an arousal component to it, and then when the culture moves a certain direction where a lot of these people are identifying as women, it just was the natural next step for Eddie.
Yeah, and it's such a shame for a lot of these people, I suppose, because many of us didn't care. We were like, do your thing. And now, because we're so involved in the politics of it and the ideology of it, and we've looked into it and we've started to understand, God, you're getting arousal out of this. I didn't really think of it that way. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to go for lunch with you if you're getting a kick out of how everybody's perceiving you. I just want to go I want to have an asexual lunch and an asexual dinner, and not have to think about what's in your pants all the time. Yeah,
it's a tough one because I think that we should still, accept people who are cross-dressing, and even if some of them are getting aroused from the whole thing, like what are we going to do? We're going to have dress codes for men and women going. I mean, there was the dust up at the GensBet conference because a very out autogynephilic male named Phil Illy decided to wear sort of a gown there, and GensBet I think did the right thing, saying, well, we're not going to have dress codes. We're not going to look at the door and be like, you're dressing too feminine for a male. So we kind of have to get over people cross-dressing. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's just, I can understand why some people might not like it. And if you don't like it, then you can excuse yourself. But I think we need to be at least accepting of that.
Yeah, I suppose it gets to the line is maybe children, schools, if people are turning up at high schools, wearing those kinds of things, and you don't really want your children being part of that.
Well, especially like the Canadian shop teacher, what's her,
the big boobs one,
with the grotesquely large prosthetic boobs, and
I thought that was trolling.
Dinner plate sized areolas. Yeah, it was completely ridiculous. I think it might have been trolling. I can't remember.
Don't know.
But either way, like, Canada came out in full support of this person's right to wear this, what is like literally just a fetish gear to school.
The extent to which it faces women. I mean, I've showed a friend of mine, a woman who's a lawyer. There's a quite famous lawyer now in the US, I think, who basically cross dresses but looks like a clown. Or looks like a prostitute. I mean, it's not cross-dressing to look like a lawyer who's a woman and is very, eloquent and elegant and everything. It was done, sexual.
Yeah.
And everybody was just bowing down to him as like, oh, yes, what a brave, stunning person you are. And it's like, you must be trolling. This is just absolutely extraordinary. Tell me briefly, I guess, what XX and XY actually means, just for those of us who don't. Like, what does it look? What's happening in our bodies? What is this?
So we're mammals, and so we have what's called chromosomal sex determination. A lot of people get confused of what it means for sex to be determined versus how sex is defined. So in nature, there's many ways that sex is determined. And all we mean by determined, it's a specific term within developmental biology that is basically referring to the mechanisms and environmental and genetic triggers that cause an embryo to develop down a pathway that will result in either a male or a female. So as I said, mammals, it's determined by chromosomes. But other species like crocodiles, for instance, and turtles, the temperature at which the eggs are incubated will determine whether the embryo develops into a male or female. So they have temperature-dependent sex determination. So when we talk about what XX and XY are in humans, those are just the chromosomal combinations that are associated with males and females. Because for males, there's a gene called SRY. It's on the Y chromosome. And the presence of that gene is what triggers males to develop, or what triggers an embryo to develop into a male down that developmental pathway.
It's like an instruction.
Yeah, it's the instructions that say, this is the instructions that will make a male. There's some people that like to say that the embryo itself is male, but I'd push back against that type of portrayal, because the sex of an individual, it's a phenotype. It's an endpoint of development that you get to. At some point along the development of an embryo, it turns into a male, but it's not a male before that. It might have the instructions to become one, but like a zygote itself isn't male or female, even if it has the instructions for it. Just like, what's the sex of an alligator egg before, at an intermediate temperature before it develops. These are sexless embryos, and sex is something that bodies develop into. So that's the relationship with chromosomes. You can have instances where that SRY gene that's typically on a Y chromosome gets transposed onto an X chromosome. And so you can have XX males, or you can have situations where the SRY gene gets shut off. And if you have XX chromosomes condition, I think it's Turner syndrome, if you're XXY, that would be Klinefelter syndrome. But if you would have Klinefelter syndrome and be XXY, but the SRY gene is turned off on your Y, you can actually be an XXY female. So you can be a female with a Y chromosome. So chromosomes, it's just the instructions. Sometimes the instructions can be weird, but that's the relationship between chromosomes and sex.
Why do men have nipples?
Yeah, so it has to do with the types of how we develop in utero, and the sex differentiating pathway doesn't really start until after the nipples are already developed. And that's just sort of this ground plan that's put in there that's ancestral in mammals, because, if you look at the evolution of sex, the sexes weren't always there. Some, initially there was just females producing eggs before.
Okay. And
males are kind of an offshoot of the normal, typical female developmental pathway. And so we just have sort of non-functional nipples. There's other things that females have, that people debate about, what is the evolved function of sort of like the female orgasm into, because it's not necessary for reproduction. And there's some people who think that it's sort of a similar situation where it's a byproduct of selection for orgasms in men. It's a highly debated field, so I won't go into the choose a side on there, but there appears to me maybe be sort of these traits that are maybe evolved for one sex, but they can't quite contain it just in one, and so there's remnants of it in the other sex that have their own possible function, or sometimes they're just there in a non-functional state.
Wait, there's a female orgasm?
So I've heard.
Why don't men's testicles have rib cages around them?
That's a good question. So some animals have them; they're internal to their body.
Oh,
yeah. Fish, for instance, have internal. I think there's some mammals that have them internalized as well. Birds, they're all internal. The main idea is sort of kind of a temperature regulation. They need to be at a certain temperature, and when it gets colder outside, many males have noticed that they kind of go up and retract into the body to get more warm, and on very hot days, they tend to hang a little bit lower. So it's this idea of temperature regulation, that there's an ideal temperature.
Oh, they do that to sort of stay warm in cold conditions.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And
I mean, they should. You'd think that they would be more robust and hard or something, because they're quite vulnerable, in a very vulnerable spot.
I heard about that point about the rib cage in Ricky Gervais's podcast. Cole Pilkington, I think, said it. Why don't they have a rib cage around? Because you'd think natural selection would allow for, some people over the years would get kicked there, and it would ruin their chance of it would ruin their chance of procreating. So there should be a rib cage there. But we're getting on to evolution and natural selection. So that's my segue: rib cage, testicles. What did Tucker Carlson, the ex-Fox News presenter, say recently on Joe Rogan?
Yeah, so he was on Rogan, and the topic of evolution came up. I didn't actually watch the whole episode. I watched the clip. So if there was more context to it that I'm not getting to, I apologize. But essentially he said that evolution, the people don't believe in evolution anymore. Is this really a thing? That the science has abandoned the topic of evolution or natural selection? And Rogan gave some pushback against this, but it wasn't very robust pushback. And as I mentioned, I kind of have a history of engaging with the creationism, intelligent design, evolution debate. And so this started a big whirlwind on Twitter, because you get someone with a high profile like Tucker Carlson on the biggest podcast in the world saying scientists don't buy evolution by natural selection anymore. And then all the people who are, already maybe believed some version of that felt emboldened to come out. And so there was at least a week where all of the evolution skeptics and deniers and all species of that came out to proclaim the death of evolution and Darwinism. So that's been an entertaining last couple of weeks as an evolutionary biologist. And I've sort of been, I knew this day was coming where I'd alienate myself from some of my more right-wing Christian audience, because at the end of the day, like, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm going to talk about evolution. And I've given talks about the evolution of sex, and had people come after the talk and say, like, I liked you, you talked about that there's only two sexes, and, you can't change sex, but they're like, don't talk about evolution, because you're going to lose everyone. I'm just like, well, I'm not here to, the reason I'm talking about this now, and I'm not in the university, is because I've refused to not talk about true things about biology. So I'm not going to bite my tongue in this crowd either. I'm going to talk about evolution and sex, and you can just deal with that if you want to.
There must be enough middle-grounded people, but this is
there are. Most people totally agree with what I'm saying, but they're not the loudest ones.
This is the thing, and you want the loud people to push your stuff more. This is a genuine problem that people like you and me, creators, not creators like a divine creator, of course, but creators in the YouTube sense and the Substack sense, it's a genuine problem that we face, because you end up growing a large profile and a large following. We rely on that for our living. And we know that beliefs are formed not necessarily around accuracy or a pursuit of accuracy, but actually around what our peers will think. So it's very hard to stay in line. Yeah. And we know that we are monetarily incentivized not to put out stuff that might piss off some of the people who joined us because of the gender stuff, but also are maybe right-wing religious people.
Yeah.
I think we want religious people to follow us. I think evolution doesn't necessarily, I'm an atheist myself, but I think you are as well, but it doesn't necessarily disprove God. I think you can have your God and your Christianity and stuff and still understand evolution. But it is a problem for not just us, but everybody. This is a real problem.
I go through and purge some number of followers every couple months, just because some people follow me and don't sort of know what my views are on other things. They just see someone who's talking about there's two sexes, and they don't know the bigger context. So I have to remind people that I'm actually an atheist and I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm going to talk about both those things if I please. So I think just bringing out that honesty and that transparency as frequently as I can makes it so my audience doesn't become so shocked when they see me say something that they might disagree with. So I try to do, because the last thing I want to do is sort of either be captured by my audience or feel like I want to censor something because I don't want to lose subscribers or something like that. So I try to foster that middle ground of people who follow me because they know I'll speak honesty on things. And because of things like Substack, I can. I don't. I'm not beholden to any one view, really.
Yeah, for now until they all leave you, and then you've got
it could
to
be.
start
Yeah.
talking about gay
Yeah.
frogs or something. Which I always say that apparently was true in the end. The gay frogs thing, it was Alex Jones.
The feminized frogs. Yeah.
Yeah, that was like
To
the
some
one
degree.
thing. It was the maddest thing he ever said, and apparently that's actually
Yeah.
true.
Doesn't make a good sound bite, but
They're turning the frogs gay.
Yeah.
That wasn't a good impression. Apparently, a lot of the issue was with the word theory. It might have even been you that tweeted it. I saw some people tweeting about this. The issue was that the scientific way of what a theory is, because he said, "Oh, it's just that's why they call it a theory. It's not even science." What does a theory mean in evolutionary theory?
It's almost nostalgic, like talking about these debates again, because I just college student me is just like, this is what I did online, is talk about these issues. The whole just a theory idea, again, it's a misunderstanding of what a theory means in science. People tend to think, oh, it's like an educated guess maybe, or it's just a wild guess. It's just a theory. That's how we use it sort of colloquially in our everyday conversation. But when scientists talk about a theory, it is not just a wild guess. It's not even just an educated guess. It's a thoroughly tested framework that interprets many different lines of evidence and facts. So, and it's important to distinguish between what facts are and theories too. So facts are just sort of the world's data, how distance from Earth to the sun, here's, the gene frequencies in this species changed from this to that and over a couple generations. Those are just facts anyone can verify on their own. And then there's the theoretical framework that explains how why we see the pattern in the fossil record, why we see a certain pattern with the species that emerge on continental islands versus volcanic islands it has to do with how old they are and what the fauna that's coming from the nearby continent versus a neighboring island or something. The evidence from the genomes and how this shows the relatedness and how evolution occurs by mutations and selection. Any one of these lines of evidence is like tremendous evidence for the fact of evolution, that evolution takes place. But then all of these combined in this theoretical framework, it's just such an insurmountable amount of evidence that all points in the same direction for the fact that evolution is a legitimate thing. And there's the fact of evolution that life has changed over time. That's an undeniable fact. That's just an observed thing. And then there's the theory of evolution. That's the mechanisms that we use to explain how this process occurred. So some people will say, well, how does evolution explain this one thing? We don't know how the joint of the weasel frog evolved. That's a weird looking thing. You can't explain that. Therefore, evolution's wrong or something. Well, just because we don't know like aspects of it, or maybe even aspects of the theory, maybe we can't explain certain things, or at least maybe some people don't think it's sufficient to explain certain things. But that still doesn't mean that the fact of evolution is incorrect, that animals didn't evolve. So it's important to keep the fact and the theory as separate.
Do we have any competing theories that are scientific that go, oh, you know what, it might be this other thing?
No, there's nothing else. So, I mean, there's other ideas that have been incorporated into evolutionary theory. I mean, Darwin did some of this very early on. So he had his idea of natural selection. But then there was this seemingly glaring contradiction that he would see something like a male peacock that is just handicapped by this tremendous amount of plumage to the point where they can barely even fly. They're just advertising to predators saying, like, kill me. I have no defenses. I'm this huge target. And this was a major big problem for Darwin's theory, because it's like, well, if it's all about survival, how can this is a huge handicap. We would not expect this to evolve. And then he did what a good scientist does and just thinks about it really hard and collects evidence. And he showed that, well, he developed the concept of sexual selection, saying, well, the peacock might be at a disadvantage for long-term survival because of this handicap, but this comes with the great benefits, because the individuals that have the most attractive plumage have an overwhelmingly higher number of offspring. And at the end of the day, evolution cares about differential reproduction. Mm-hmm. How many copies of your genes are you putting in the next generation? And so you could say that, well, sexual selection is this other theory, but it was incorporated into Darwinian evolution. It's all part of Darwin. There's ideas of neutral selection of, not all traits are adaptations. They can just sort of they can hitchhike with adaptations. They can just be the result of neutral genetic drift. There's been all these interesting discoveries along the way, but they all fit really snugly within the pre-existing framework, which also gives good evidence that the framework is super robust, because none of these new discoveries have conflicted with it. They've all just settled so perfectly within it and actually enhance the entire, that gives more insights to other aspects of the theory we might not have had before.
You'd think the animals that have survived through sort of sexual selection, I would think over time they would die out because, okay, they're reproducing a lot within, so it's good within your tribe to have this big peacock feather and stuff. But you're not actually adapting for your environment. You're going to get killed easily. How have they survived this long?
Well, I mean, I suppose it could. I mean, you might be able to have, if you introduce a new predator that has a specialist for peacocks or something, they could wipe them out at such a high rate where, the handicap isn't overcome by reproduction and things like that. I mean, it's going to depend on the environment. If the environment changes suddenly, then it could be a dead end potentially. But if it's more gradual change, which is sort of how it's been more in the past, we're seeing a lot more mixing now because we're introducing species like crazy across borders that would naturally be like barriers to these types of things happening. And that's what invasive species are. They're just, they came from somewhere else and they're free from the pressures that have kept them in check in their previous habitat. And now they're just running amok in current habitats because they have no predators or the environments are just a certain way for them. So I mean, anything could definitely happen, but there's situations where it could become a real handicap rather than just sort of a handicap in the sexual selection sense.
One of the issues I've got with talking to lots of different kinds of people with different theories and different knowledge and whatever it might be, is that I've come to realize that I have to take everything on faith. I realized this while I was debating a flat earther, that I don't know how to prove the earth is not flat. So I've taken it on faith from scientists and textbooks and things that it's not. I've never seen it be spherical. I believe 99.9% that it is, because I don't know why these people would all be lying and I don't know how that might happen. And I've not seen the fossils and things like that. So I suppose you scientists are asking us, just as religious people might, to take everything on faith. And it's not a criticism. I don't know what other way it can be.
Yeah, I mean, you can't expect everyone to go out on a dig, and then if you're out there, how can we know that these bones weren't just put in there for us to dig up later on? And not everyone's going to go be able to do genetic testing on their own. And how do we know the outputs of the computers? It's not behind the scenes. So I mean, there is a lot of things you just sort of have to. I don't like using the word faith here, but maybe you have to trust the process. There's a lot of aspects of biology that aren't politicized, where there's no reason where we should suspect that the population geneticists studying fruit flies or guppies or something have an agenda for what they're doing, but they're using the same genetics that we're using to study humans, that type of thing. And so there's a lot of students that are out there who join genetics labs who aren't doing anything with humans. They're just doing their stuff with whatever species that has no political ramifications whatsoever. There's no reason for them to be biased and skew the data, except maybe climb the ladder and publish papers or whatever. That's another story. But yeah, you just you need to do the work and try to understand the history of these ideas, the history of fields like genetics, how we got to the current methods that we have right now, from Mendel up until now. And there's a rich history. It takes time. I mean, you have to do your own research on these things and not just watch clips on TikTok or even coming from the right or the left or wherever it is. And if you just want to be agnostic about these things, then that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do as well. Otherwise, refrain from having strong opinions until you've done a sufficient amount of research.
We talked about the problems with the gender ideology, prisons, sports, women's spaces. That's part of the issue. If we, policies. What is for you the biggest danger with people believing that evolution is only a theory, is not real?
I think evolution roots us in reality. I mean, I got into evolution because I thought it helped answer a lot of big, I guess, some of the fundamental questions of existence. Really, just like, who we are, what are we doing here, how long have we been here, why do we behave these certain ways, why do our brains work like this, why do we deceive ourselves, the social dynamics that we have, why are we so afraid of being ostracized from our groups, that types of stuff. Dating, men and women's interactions, like all of this can be explained. We will not know all the details, but like large swaths of it can be explained with evolutionary theory. And if you don't have this framework of it, it's just this complete chaotic mess. But you talk to the evolutionary psychologists, they can talk about, why are males more sexually violent? Like this explains incarceration rates, explains, sexual assaults, differences between males and females in the types of hobbies we get interested in, people versus things. This is all fits in within an evolutionary framework, and it makes sense of the world in a way that we would just have absolutely no way to explain if we didn't have this. So, and it seeps into everything. We're evolved. Our behaviors have evolved. Our bodies have evolved. For medicine, you need to know about evolution. For, if you're going to get a transplant, we know because of evolution that if you have an identical twin, hey, you should maybe get a kidney from them. Or if you have a brother, that's the next best thing. You probably don't want to go too much further out, from that. If you're going to get, a cross-species transplant, I think they've done with chimpanzees before, they're closer to humans. Might not want to go for a pig because that's even more distantly related. This is all explained by evolutionary biology.
Yeah. My worst nightmare that a close family member needs a kidney. I suppose the worst is that I need a kidney.
Yeah.
Well, it depends what the frame I'm looking at. And speaking of that, brilliant. We're in New York, of course. Speaking of that sort of, ostracism, as you mentioned from the tribe, why it feels so bad to be ostracized. I do want to use this moment as a plea for people to speak up, centrists to speak up, moderates, people who are not so far one way or the other and who are tired of magical thinking, because we need more people to do it. And where can those people go and find your work?
So I'm on Substack. My Substack is realitieslaststand.com. I chose that name because I talk mainly about the biology of sex on there, but not just. I'm trying to expand the range of topics that we talk about. But the biology of sex is something like everyone knows that males and females exist, and if we can be convinced that sex is a social construct, that males and females aren't real, that your eyes are being deceived, then there's no other thing that you can't be convinced of or out of. So that's the name of the Substack. Again, realitieslaststand.com. I write on there. It's sort of like a magazine where I publish other people's work too on various topics. And it's really the existence of that. It helps me be able to talk about these topics and be a biologist outside of academia that is able to say the things that a lot of people don't want to say about this topic.
Who's a heretic you admire?
So there's a lot of heretics that I admire. As an evolutionary biologist, I think I have to go back to the OG Charles Darwin, though, because he's dealing with a lot of the things that a lot of people deal with today about the fear of social ostracism, of questioning, these sacrosanct beliefs, either coming from a Christian right or the woke left or whatever it was. There wasn't wokeism back then. But he had this amazing idea that was based on a lot of intense field work, looking through museum specimens. This guy had just so much time to devote his life to this topic. And when he stumbled across this idea that evolution by natural selection, he knew it was huge. He knew it was going to be groundbreaking, and he knew that he was going to be attacked for it brutally. And so he did what a lot of scientists sadly don't do as much today, is he didn't publish right away. He just wanted to build the strongest case possible. And he did this by setting out all the aspects or the things that evolution that he couldn't quite explain now, and said, if we can't explain this, if I can't explain this under my theory, then the whole thing is wrong. And then he went and did his best to falsify it as much as he possibly could. And then he realized that he was unable to falsify this idea. And then he built up this massive case using, what we call artificial selection, with dog breeds, He did, comparative anatomy. He was going to write this enormous tome of a book that you'd probably just release before he died, just, to put out there, or at least when he's very old. But he was forced to write like a shorter version, which is The Origin of Species, which is still hundreds of pages long, because his friend Alfred Russel Wallace was kind of stumbled independently on this idea. So he ended up publishing it, his own book, the abridged version of his giant book. But he's I think the ultimate scientist, the way he approached the topic, the way he knew it was going to be socially unacceptable, but he did it anyway because to him it was the truth, and that's what ultimately he cared about as a scientist. So I think we all should try to emulate Darwin when we're out there, especially scientists. I think he's just a model human and scientist.
Oh, brilliant.
Great heretic. Yeah.
Fantastic
for sure.
heretic. Yeah. People, please do go to Reality's Last Stand. That's not going to be here. That's going to be down there in the description. Reality's Last Stand. That's Colin's Substack. Go and sign up. Please support my guest. He's been absolutely wonderful. And keep watching this show. There will be something similar there. I'm going to put it there and hit the like button because it helps to spread this out and start speaking up about centrism and being moderate and magical thinking. Come on, we can do it.